This is co-hosted through Crisis Ready and GFDRR. We usually meet at the end, last week of every month on Thursday, 11 o'clock in the morning. Eastern time, and our next meeting will be at the end of April, and we'll focus on the public release of a white paper on mobility data and public health emergencies that a number of folks that are here on this call and in the audience have participated in helping to form. So look for that towards the end of April. Let me share my screen really quick and we can get going. Okay. So like I mentioned, our topic for today, we're joined by Jos Behrens from the UN OCHA Center for Humanitarian Data, Rohini Swaminathan from UNICEF, and Nadi Raymond from the Yale Jackson School of International Affairs. And we're going to be talking about the role of mobility data in understanding displacement in the war in Ukraine. Just a quick note on the displacement part of this in terms of overall numbers. This has been maybe one of the headline issues of the war overall since February 24th, when Russia invaded Ukraine. There have been 4.1, according to UNHCR, 4.1 million international refugees, international displaced persons, and the current estimate from IOM is right around 6.5 million internally displaced as well. So this is nearly a quarter of the total population of Ukraine from prior to the war. So this is a long-term mobility and displacement crisis. And we've been seeing some issues early on with questions around application of mobility data in highly sensitive ways within the war, within the space of the war itself. Probably the most famous case happened right at the beginning when Google Maps was researchers, in this case, a professor from Middlebury Institute of International Studies. This was profiled in the Washington Post. Began looking at Google Maps and seeing traffic jams through the telemetry data on Google Maps, and seeing Russian armor columns. And he was then identifying invasion patterns in advance through the telemetry data on Google Maps. This was subsequently shut down by Google as they became concerned that telemetry data inside Ukraine would be dual use data, that it would be possible for both sides in the conflict to utilize data that was revealing patterns. And there have subsequently been multiple telemetry data sets that have been subject to scrutiny over dual use issues. We'll pick that up later. What we've been doing at Crisis Ready is looking at data that was made available for the areas, the countries bordering Ukraine, that was made available through the Data for Good program at Meta through the COVID data sharing arrangements. So this is data that was actually available already at the start of the war because it was made available for COVID, that looks at changes in population density and vectoral movement, so to and from matrices. And we've been looking at summarized statistics. So these are looking at the slopes of linear regression lines on changes in the percentage of population density change in admin 2 level areas of the surrounding countries, where you can see, the top map is looking at immediately from the war and from the invasion on the February 24th until March 10th, and then the March 11th to 28th period, there was a peak in movement across the borders that happened around the March 10th time period. There's been continuing movement over the borders, but it has sloped down in terms of the rate ever since then. And you can see significant differences in where you're seeing concentrations of population density change across all of the neighboring countries. A lot of this concentrates in and around cities, Budapest, Warsaw, Krakow, Bucharest in Romania, etc. And so, this is designed to be high-level trend analysis that gives some indication of the direction of change in population density for areas where we're concerned in the response community about being able to provide effective refugee services and understand where you might see pressurization of social services and other things around the space in the European Union receiving refugees. We've been using the social connectedness index in combination with mobility data. So that's from Facebook, looking at on-platform social connections and the likelihood that Ukrainians are connected on-platform to various areas in the European Union, and then looking at where mobility patterns over time are lining up or not lining up with those areas. It tends to be Poland is far more socially connected to Ukraine than other areas, as well as the Czech Republic. We've seen movement throughout all of these areas, but a much more concerted longer term pattern of movement within Poland that may be correlated with social connectedness, as well as just the ability to move as refugees look for areas where they have friendly relationships, communities of support. We're putting out a dashboard to look at lower level and more granular variances in this, and you can get all of this ultimately through the website at Crisis Ready, and we'll be sharing out these slides. So that's just a little bit of background on what we have been doing. Let me stop share. And now I'd like to kind of turn it over to my colleagues, starting with Jos Behrens from UN OCHA, who is going to talk about OCHA's data sensitivity guidelines and a lot of the thinking that's been evolving within the Center for Humanitarian Data around data sets like what I just described. So Jos, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Andrew. And just checking that you can hear me okay. Great. So hi, everyone. It's good to be here. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Jos Behrens. I'm a data responsibility officer with UN OCHA's Center for Humanitarian Data based in The Hague. We were founded in 2017 with the mission of increasing the use and impact of data in humanitarian response. And in particular, I work on what we call data responsibility. So really the safe, ethical, and effective management of data in operational response. From that perspective, I'll talk a little bit about the support that we've been providing to the OCHA office in Ukraine. And starting with maybe an introduction of data responsibility. As I mentioned, this is the safe, ethical, and effective management of data in humanitarian response, which means that we do not just look at data protection and other, let's say, restrictive and regulatory aspects of data management, but also really try and promote the use of data where that is possible and where that could lead to positive impact. We do that both for personal as well as non-personal data. So where data protection and privacy really tend to focus on personal data management, we also include the management of non-personal data. And I think all of these elements will come back later on in the discussion on this panel here. One key document to keep in mind is the Iasc, the Interagency Standing Committee's operational guidance on data responsibility. I'll drop a link to that in the chat here. This is really a key document that was launched in February of last year, and it's the first system-wide guidance on this topic within the humanitarian sector. And it sets out a set of key principles to abide by when managing data in humanitarian response. It also sets out a series of actions to take at different levels in the response in order to guarantee responsible data management. So again, dropping in that link into the chat. And this is also the lens that we used when we looked at how we could best support the Ukraine response in the past month or so. Primarily, what we saw coming up very early on in the response is questions around data sensitivity. So how sensitive, for example, population figures should be considered, or what we call 3W data. So who's doing what where in terms of humanitarian response. Right from the beginning of the humanitarian operation, there have been questions around how sensitive these types of data should be considered. And when I say beginning of the humanitarian operation, I of course mean the last iteration of the response since about the 24th of February. In response to those questions around data sensitivity, we developed what's called a data and information sensitivity classification for the Ukraine response. This document focuses on the response in Ukraine itself. So as Andrew mentioned, of course, there's also the dimension of the refugee response in surrounding countries. This document is really meant for the response in Ukraine itself, where OCHA has the response mandate. But we also have heard that it's being used as a reference in surrounding countries. So it can certainly be used there as well. Another point to note about the sensitivity classification is that it's a living document, so it's been evolving. We're already in the third iteration, and it's being changed based on our, let's say, increased understanding of how sensitive data should be considered in this specific environment. And it's also not meant as a, let's say, a hard restriction. So exceptions can definitely be made. And this is to be used as a reference in the response. And I'll drop in a link to this sensitivity classification in the chat as well. Given the focus of this panel, it's key to mention that mobility data, and especially live mobility data, has been a part of this sensitivity classification from the very start. And that was prompted mainly by the occurrence that Andrew just mentioned regarding the Google live traffic data. We heard that come up as well, and so we decided to include this live mobility data in the sensitivity classification, and it's classified under severe sensitivity, so the highest level of sensitivity within the classification. To give a bit more of a sense of how this classification is supposed to be used, it has 4 different levels of sensitivity, going from low or no all the way to severe sensitivity. And per level, we indicate different types of data and information as they should be classified for those levels. And finally, per level, we also indicate how that data should be shared. And so we offer different channels for sharing that data. For low or no sensitivity, that includes, for example, the humanitarian data exchange. When it goes to more high levels of sensitivity, we talk about bilateral data sharing and other methods to really restrict access to how data is being shared. So I think those were some of the key points to mention, and I'm sure we'll return to a lot of these different elements later on in the discussion. But Andrew, for now, back over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Jos. And I would highly recommend that everybody who's working with data for the Ukraine response take a look at the links that Jos just posted. I wanted to turn next to Rohini and get a sense of just how you all have been thinking at UNICEF about these same issues that that Jos just brought up and that have been evolving in your own response efforts over the past few weeks.
Thank you, Andrew. And hi, everyone. My name is Rohini, working with UNICEF Emergencies, focusing mostly on geospatial risk analysis. Andrew, I should begin by saying how impressive it is to see the interagency collaboration on data sharing this far. I think this is the first time all the agencies have come together and, like just mentioned, putting thoughts in the beginning of the crisis already on data sensitivity, what data we are looking at. And we have made strides to avoid duplication of efforts, especially on data processing, like the one for mobility data. We're going in the right direction in making these data sets easily accessible, digestible, and useful. In general, I believe mobility data either gets vastly overstated or terribly understated on its use cases. And statistical analysis are not straightforward for many to, especially in the chaotic days of initial response, to assimilate that, to understand and how to make best use of it. And I think Direct Relief has done an excellent job this time to make that more accessible for us. Well, we do know that it does not give a precise picture, and there are a lot of caveats, which possibly we will talk more about. It is still very valuable to get a broader picture of where people are moving towards, especially in the first few days when there is a lot of confusing information. We don't have reliable data sets to tap into. One of the possible and what seems as the most obvious use cases from UNICEF end is to better inform and better target our programming activities. By knowing where the population are moving towards, we can really think about our program intervention in the right location, see where to deploy our mobile teams once they are on the ground. But I'm saying this, that we should get this picture of geographical focus and hotspot areas from mobility data as only one of the indicators of many indicators we need. I wouldn't say that we use this directly for our operational planning and decision making yet. There is a good chance the most vulnerable who are in dire need for humanitarian aid, whom we want to target, could become largely invisible in this data. We could largely assume most people have access to phones these days and access to Facebook or other platforms, especially Viber that we are looking into, but might not be the case for all the vulnerable people. And that being said, it's not always straightforward to get this information on vulnerable people in other ways too. So what the best approach that we are looking at UNICEF is to triangulate the mobility data with all the other indicators that we have so far. Most, if not all, decisions we make as UNICEF are made together with the host government. So that's whom we rely heavily on to provide the information on population movement. But we consider using this mobility data as one of the advocacy on target areas where we could look into. So in the specific context of Ukraine, thanks to Direct Relief, we were able to integrate the mobility data directly into a dashboard that we internally have to monitor the situation, to better understand the context analysis, along with the UNICEF specific layers on where we think this could move on. So that's one of the first use case. And I should agree that we are still working on better understanding how to integrate to the other aspects of response. We are even having an internal discussion on the use of mobility data, even in monitoring and evaluation as the crisis progress. One of the challenges that comes to my mind that we should highlight and discuss are, what do we lose by using a data collection system that are primarily designed and used for a different purpose, right? Like all these mobility data coming from Facebook, Meta, I keep saying Facebook, Meta, Viber, any of the platforms are designed for a completely different purpose. So we are using them as a proxy. And Andrew, as you had mentioned, I think we should continue working with academic and research community to better understand what these caveats are and how best we can integrate into program intervention. So I wouldn't say as UNICEF, we are completely against or for the use. We are in the middle where we are trying to best understand how to bring this data together with other indicators and design our program intervention. Over to you, Andrew.
Thank you. Yeah, these are key points. Especially, I want to emphasize the provisional nature of a lot of this analysis. With that in mind, let me turn finally to Nadia Raymond. We've talked about issues related to this kind of work for many years now, especially around data ethics and sort of the balance between kind of effective analysis, individual privacy, and then community identifying information, or the way that we can inadvertently reveal significant facts about communities that may put them at risk through even well-meaning kind of uses of humanitarian data. So I want to turn it over to you, Nadia, about what you'd like to kind of put on the table as key issues here.
Yeah, my problem right now is there's so much to say. and it's gonna be a multiple car pileup, because this is all I think about. For those of us who've been working on this issue now for like 10, 12 years, we were seen at the beginning as Chicken Little, or the boy who cried wolf, about the ethical issues here, where they're like, no, it's fine, it's going to be all good. And now I feel like Bruce Willis in Die Hard, where it's like, welcome to the party, pal, you know. and so it's so happy. It sounds weird, but it makes me so happy that we're having these conversations in a reality-based way. The magical social entrepreneurship, crisis mapping, everything's going to be gravy, period, is over. And now we can get very concrete about mitigation and about articulation, not only of our responsibilities and how those responsibilities translate the humanitarian principles into action with this type of mobility data, but how we begin to build the capacities at where the rubber meets the road in the field to have the not just ethical, but the technical skills to act ethically. So that's my headline here, is that having codes and guidance is critical. And as someone, and I'm looking at Jos here, and I've worked very closely with Jos and others to try to build guidelines and codes, that's a starting point. But now we're moving out of that phase to how do we embed the 4 C's: culture, competency, capacity, and capability in the right places. And this is not a new issue as it relates to mobility in humanitarian response. It's fascinating to read the joint evaluation of emergency assistance to Rwanda from 1994. And one of the biggest problems in the Great Lakes crisis, the evaluation was from 98, but one of the big problems in the Great Lakes crisis was knowing where the refugees were. And Oxfam very famously sent out a reconnaissance group to try to test the assumption about where the refugees were coming from. And they found 120,000 refugees that no one had prepared for, and that they didn't know where they were. And that became one of the catalytic moments in looking at how our coordination, how our technical elements related to warning were being done at that point. And now we have sort of the opposite problem, which is we have the potential for 4 types of data disasters, as we wrote, Ziad Al-Achkar and I, in the paper Data Preparedness. We have 4 types of data disasters now, which are sort of in many ways, the opposite of the paradigm in the Great Lake crisis. Deluge. Our systems of response get overwhelmed by too much data. Data disparities. We have data about some groups very clearly with great granularity and no data about others. We have data damage. We have the right data. We're using it effectively from a technical perspective, but we're doing harm with the damage by its application. And then the 4th type of data disaster that we face is data droughts, where we don't have the data we need at the times we need it. And so back to this question of how do we embed culture, competency, capacity, and capability where we need it, it's really going to be crucial for us to look at Ukraine in a formal after action process. So thinking back to Rwanda, and I think someone on this call should volunteer their organization and call DANITA or USAID to ask for the money now on doing an AAR on the use of mobility data in Ukraine sometime this summer, because how we did the response here is going to be the template for everything that comes after this, because the world is going to look more and more like Ukraine. There will be more connectivity and more granularity in the populations. There will be more utilization of this data for kinetic action by militaries and non-state actors. And third, there will be more reliance on it by the Oxfams of today doing reconnaissance in the Great Lakes crises of today. There will be more reliance on this as the basis, back to Rohini's excellent points, you know, that there will be more reliance on it at the same time that this is an approximate, probabilistic picture from data that was designed for commercial purposes and never designed to either be safe in this way, to be accurate in this way, or to be actionable in this way. And so I will shut up now with my closing sentence here from Bruce Willis on the 18th floor of Nakatomi Plaza. The closing sentence is this. We need to build our after action now. We need to build the learning now. We need to build the capture of critical incidents, looking at you guys, OCHA and Den Haag, using the critical incident guidance note. We need to do that now to do it right. And I think we're going to have an AAR at the back of this where, yeah, there will be some screw ups, but there will also be some new tactics, techniques, and procedures that are going to become standard because I think they're working. Over.
Thanks, Nadia. And I want to echo that there is way too much to discuss here. So we will have to pick and choose how to focus. Also, I want to say to folks in the audience, if you want to put comments or questions into the chat, we will pick them up in due time and make sure that we incorporate folks, because there's a lot of people that have experience with everything we've been talking about here in the audience. I want to pick up first on this question about purpose and how we understand the responsibility by companies to provide data that is not designed for purpose into these types of sensitive situations. I mean, we have a data responsibility and ethics framework that focuses quite a lot on what we should not do, right, around sensitivity guidelines and the ways that we can say that there are certain things that should not be produced. But how do we understand even how to communicate what ought to be produced, and whether companies that are creating this kind of data for other purposes, do they have a responsibility to provide it at all? And I want to emphasize here that there's a lot of mobility data that is actually useful but not being provided in this response. And I want to emphasize that is around the call detail records, cell phone data records, where we can get a much more kind of granular view from telecoms, often which, to Rohini's point, may actually incorporate a more representative sample of a population than we're able to get. But that would require a sense of not just prohibition from doing certain things, but a responsibility to provide. Is there such a responsibility? And how would we understand that?
Yes, and this goes to the core transformational issue of our generation of humanitarian aid workers. That if I talk to aid workers that are 10 to 15 years, sort of beyond or before us, they don't get it as osmotically as I think our generation, which is information is aid. Information is aid. And not only is information aid, information is a predicate to accessing other forms, traditional forms of aid, food, water, shelter, medicine. And that is a radical moment of transformation, which is that the access to ICTs and your legibility in ICTs becomes a necessary predicate more and more for accessing aid. And that's happened in the past 5 to 10 years. And humanitarianism will never be the same because of that revolution. It's not It's not kind of a feature, of now. It is the center of gravity of now. And so we have a responsibility. And I think that this is a plug I want to make to say, hey, isn't it great that we finally did ethics and data responsibility, guys? Because by starting with what we don't want to have happen, we can now get to the good part, right? And the good part is what we have a responsibility to provide and how we can begin to measure the impact, the good, and technically refine that into better. So we ate our vegetables and we're beginning to eat our vegetables. And now maybe the candy can come.
Absolutely. Rohini and Yes, did you want to pick up on that, the vegetables dimension of this?
And I agree with Nathaniel. I think one of the things I would put forward is the responsibility falls both on the company making this data available, as well as us as a user, the humanitarian community, making use of this data to make those crucial decisions, which is, let's be honest, in many of those cases, it's going to be life-changing for thousands of people. So it's not something to ever take it lightly. And I will probably go back to my point on that academic research. I think this is still fairly new. I do agree on Nathaniel's point that there are more data than less for the last almost 10 years, but using mobility data to such an extent, even a few years ago, we used to use this as just a layer in the backdrop or just to understand where 3G, 4G connections are and so on. But now we are using more and more into our operational planning and decision making and thinking process. So perhaps if we have more thought process or academic research backing how best to use this data, and on the sensitivity that just rightly mentioned on the protection issues and so on, that would be very helpful before we start operationalizing it already.
Absolutely. And Jos, how is the center now thinking about this question of the responsibility to provide?
It's a great question, Andrew. And I think building on both what Nadi as well as Rohini have been saying, I think if we're going by the idea that Nadi brought up of information as aid, then we'll certainly need to figure out how that information should be provided in order to be effectively used in humanitarian response, right? So if there is such a responsibility for private sector actors, and it's really not for me to speak to that necessarily, but what we will need to figure out is how that information can be ingested and built into existing work processes in humanitarian response. And this is something Rohini was talking to earlier as well. That's not always the case yet, right? So we've seen, including in the Ukraine response, quite a few offers of private sector information, which may not have been used as effectively as they could have, just because we as humanitarians are not used to dealing with this type of data. At the same time, there is a big interest in using these new forms of data. And an example is the meta data that we have on HDX, on the Humanitarian Data Exchange. So Meta shares population density maps, and that's some of the most downloaded data on our platform. That's not to say that we know that it has impact in humanitarian response, but it certainly, there's a lot of interest in this data. So that would maybe be the key point, is that we really need to figure out both on the private sector and on the humanitarian side, how to use this data to actually create impact. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to that point, and this picks up as well, I think some of what Rohini and Nadi were also talking about in terms of capacity and technical ability as well. This is novel data and it requires novel methods. I want to maybe to that end pick up on what Heather Lesson was flagging in the chat around data literacy, the need to manage data complexity and data management processes that are needing to adapt constantly now in the middle of complex environments. Heather, I don't know if you wanted to jump in and ask that more in your own words, or I'm happy to bring you off mute. or folks can go ahead and respond directly. But how should we think about data literacy and capacity on the humanitarian side? So there's responsibilities on the private sector side, but the agencies as well need to then have effective capacity technically and data literacy on staff in order to manage these kinds of data. How do we build that?
Maybe not focusing right from the start on the management of this type of data, but I will use this this opportunity to mention that at the Center for Humanitarian Data, we have a data literacy work stream, which really is focused on making sure that our humanitarian colleagues have the skills they need to work with data. And I think that's really where we lay the foundation and the start of then being able to move on to some of these more non-traditional and what some might call advanced uses of data that you mentioned, Andrew. But I think we should really start at the beginning and make sure that humanitarians have the basic skills of working with data that they need. Thanks.
Just to pause
yeah,
really, Joe, can you unblock Heather? Can you? She seems to be not able to jump in. I just wanted to make sure she has a chance.
Yes, doing that now.
Sorry, Nettie. While we were unblocking Heather, maybe you can go ahead.
Yeah, just in 2016, when Iasc and I worked on the OCHA Data Responsibility Think Brief in the lead up to the World Humanitarian Summit, Iasc in that document made a critical point that I want to remind us about. And it really became the first point in the document, which is data responsibility occurs in the humanitarian data ecosystem. And that's critical when we talk about the data literacy aspect, because it isn't just about see one, do one for your staff in the field. It is about thinking about literacy in terms of the connectivity of this ecosystem. That's not just your literacy, it's the combined common literacy that determines success. And so if we're just like, oh, well, we trained our staff at CARE, whoop-de-doo, you know, the fact is, how do we train the ecosystem, right? And so that ecosystem is really a Matryoshka doll, a Russian nesting doll of 4 levels that are connected in Venn diagrams with each other. You have your staff and your organization. You have the organizations in the next part of the nesting doll, the organizations that you partner with and work with in your operational group. Then third, you have the entire set of humanitarian organizations that your networks of networks interact with. And then fourth are non-humanitarians, back to this point, which it can include private sector, governments, and most importantly, the affected communities themselves that are generating, being affected and affecting these literacy loops. And so that's the challenge. And that's really hard when we're talking about literacy, is we're talking about not training an org or training a staff member. We're talking about cultural change in a universe of organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in that context of the kind of universe of actors and how we think about this ecosystem, I mean, it seems like Rohini's point then about inequity in who's in the data and actually who are the actors we're talking about, right? I mean, we have a persistent problem with incorporation of local actors into response. This may be magnified by the kinds of data types that we're working on. How do we both correct for that in the data access questions and representativeness and other factors, and in who gets to use insights from this data, and how do we make it meaningful in that kind of localized context? Did you want to pick that up, Rohini, from your own sense of like how we kind of think about these equity issues?
No, thanks, Andrew. Definitely, it's probably beyond me and would require a lot more thinking into this. But one of the things that we do understand, many of the agencies in the UN as well as outside are doing a lot of effort in doing an assessment and collecting data more systematically and structurally. And this is very visible in the Ukraine context as well, where the data collection systems have kicked in much faster than they would otherwise.
think we may have momentarily lost Rohini.
Or is then improving those data collection tools that we have, and how we do them at the cluster level or interagency level. I know I sound like a very UN person right now saying these things, but I think that's one way we can ensure that we do capture and represent equally all of them, and do not leave population who are exceptionally in need out of our thinking. Just one quick point, going back to the question on the data literacy that Heather raised, which is a challenge, which I really want to touch base on. Well, at UNICEF, we have a lot of internal programs, structural programs to improve data literacy for our staff. It's not always the case. Like, it's completely different taking an online course on, how to use data systems than how to actually use them during the crisis. So what we have noticed, especially here in Ukraine crisis response, is we pushed it through from the beginning. We put up a data analysis, context analysis system as risk analysis back in November. And we kind of repurposed that dashboard, which hosts more than 20-30 layers right now, and pushed it at different levels, including senior management, regional, and at country office at the last end on how our operations are designed, and just helping people understand. Just a 5-minute call saying, hey, this is how we're going to use this, and having that literacy spread one-on-one really helped to improve that consumption.
Absolutely. I want to maybe pick up on this through Jennifer Leaning as well, had mentioned in this question around the complexity of local response ecosystems and how that reflects on some of these same issues that that Rohini was just mentioning. I don't, Jennifer, did you want to ask that more directly?
Well, yes, thank you. This is a fascinating talk, and I apologize for entering late and not hearing Rohini's presentation. I intuited much of what Natty was saying, even though I arrived in the middle of his talk, because I don't know all his points of view, but I know where he is usually heading. I think this is fascinating, and I'm not telling anyone on this call anything new, because this is a very experienced group of people. But I would just urge us to realize kind of how frenetic and exhausted it is at the field, at the field level. I'm thinking particularly about medical and health humanitarian responders. I mean, there is so much coming in, and they are picking up a lot of information, not by asking it, but it is volunteered by patients or their address and where they're coming from. You get to know what is going on in a particular near area of where the hospital or the medical station is situated. And so this relationship to patient need, geography, and access to healthcare is already part of a complex understanding from the standpoint, again, of health humanitarians, of what's needed where. And it would seem to me that we might need to, and there's a, I'm suggesting this, but there are many negatives to this suggestion. We might need to think with the sort of deputy directors, and in UNICEF, there are going to be a number of different people. All organizations have a level where there is some time to think. It's, I don't know exactly, it varies by organization, but we should be thinking with that level of thought enablers to then figure out what partitions we should make in the data. That is, what is very important to WFP may not be that important to field workers at a hospital. And so my concern about deluging them with data, which take time to read, as well as a certain level of sleep to understand, needs to be in our mind as we're thinking about the end users. This is something we all know. I just would like to bring it up. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Actually, we can't expect that we're going to be able to translate data into the same kind of messages for everyone, and we may not actually have people feeding back from the field level into actually being able to ask the questions of folks that are doing this kind of analysis. I think these feedback loops often just don't exist, and they're very hard to create in the middle of a very dynamic situation. I want to give the Rohini, Natty, and Yos maybe a chance to respond to what Jennifer was just saying about some of these translational dynamics.
Yost, do you want to kick off, or Rohini?
I'm happy to kick us off, and thanks, Jennifer, for that great comment. I think it's exactly in line with the way we at the Center for Humanitarian Data also think about how we both present and develop the data and information and products that we work on. And one of the examples that I was going to drop into the chat, but actually I see that our colleague Joel from the Pacific Disaster Center has just dropped in the link as well. Is to the Ukraine Data Explorer that we've developed. I think this is an example of how we try and make it easier for our users to navigate to the data they need and to avoid them wasting time sort of digging through data that's not directly relevant to them. And so we do that by having this interactive visualization with different layers of data that can be toggled on or off, and that help more quickly navigate to data that people are looking for. And thanks again for that great comment.
Yeah, and I just want to say, Jennifer, I've been learning from you for over 21 years, so nothing has changed, and you're hitting the critical point.
But Natty, I'm in that generation that is 15 to 20 years ahead of you guys, maybe more. So yeah, my incapacities are among those that you're addressing, and I totally defer to your expertise on these. Thank you.
So before I make my comment, I just want to say, if you want to see the history of humanitarianism, look where Jennifer Leading has already been in terms of seeing the future of where we're going. She's always been the leader and still is. So I just want to pick up on Jennifer's point that she's really asking the question we have not wanted to answer, which is about clusters. And we have to have the cluster conversation. And for about 10 years now, I've been trying to get, particularly at Global Protection Cluster, for us to choose. Does this live in ETC? It does not. This is not an ETC problem. Does it live in health? Does it live in WASH? Well, it lives across them, but we need to have one cluster that is made the duty bearer on this. And frankly, I think it needs to be protection on one part of this, which is, okay, the do no harm, the primum non nocere side, but then we need another cluster to hold the question of coordinating critical information requirements. And what are the decisions that different clusters need to make? And how do we make sure that the different clusters are identifying their CIRs, or critical information requirements, to scenario, to context? And that decision on coordination is something that we have not wanted to talk about. And so that means that HDX and our folks in Den Haag with OCHA are the de facto, and excellent at it, but the de facto coordination cell across these issues.
Rohini, were you gonna?
Yeah, just a very quick point. Jennifer, thank you so much. You touched on a very, very crucial point there on the complexity and less more on the connectivity issue, but the complexity of the data itself. We put together this fancy, shiny dashboard with all the data sets automatically updated, pulled in through APIs, and I got a request yesterday morning for a paper map that could be printed and distributed right away. So we are not negating that at all in communicating this. One of the challenges which we have addressed in the past is by combining this qualitative and quantitative, not having a 20-page report or not just having a dashboard that is very complicated for people to use, but bring them together in a way that is easily accessible. So we have moved towards that interactive reporting format, combining the data, but with the 4 lines on what the data is saying, and analyzing that it is easy for people to assimilate in plain language, in simple language rather than complicated. But I do not understate that complexity, especially in data sets like the mobility data, which comes with the caveats on what percentage of confidence we have, and anything more than mean, I'm losing my people. Not necessarily saying that they cannot understand it, they just don't have the time or the energy to take that in during the response. So I think we need a lot more conversation on how to make this data set more digestible. And Andrew, I think Direct Relief has done an excellent job in that direction already with the mobility data, and hopefully we can work more on that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I do think that we've been at Crisis Study been trying to figure out, what is the form of presentation of this data that is most likely to lead towards someone taking at least one meaningful insight away from it, and putting it into very complex kind of interactive forms, enables analysis, but often at the cost of clarity among decision makers. And I think this balance is something that we always have to kind of bear in mind. I wanted to kind of pick up and invite Ingmar Weber to ask this question around, and I would frame it around how are we also learning from the use of satellite imagery in these cases. There's obviously a parallel question around here, but there's also in many ways a longer history to the same types of ethical and data protection questions that we're now encountering with data from mobile sensors, that is, from the history of the use of satellite imagery in these contexts. Ingmar, did you want to come in and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I mean, just to mention indirect mobility data, right? And so in this specific context, we've started to analyze a high-resolution satellite imagery from Maxar to look for evidence of cars, basically, sort of computer vision. So you can sort of count cars in different cities, and then you can sort of do this, across several sort of snapshots across time, and you can sort of see cars, sort of abandoning, let's say, Mariupol, and sort of cars and aggregating in Lviv in the West, right? And even though it's not directly mobility data, we don't have sort of origin destination or so it still helps to sort of map population movements. So just sort of to mention, sort of maybe not so obvious type of mobility data that I think will become more and more easily accessible in the future.
So next week, I will be saying a lot more about this as it relates to Ukraine that I'm limited on discussing now, but watch this space. I just want to flag in before the muzzle comes off in a few days. I want to flag the issue that temporal resolution in terms of Earth orbital sensors is increasing rapidly. So we have Planet, and we also have higher rates of refresh on more passive sensors like NASA Landsat than we did years ago. We are at a moment now where we can't have this conversation about ping data in terms of mobility data without talking about the interpolation of that data with geospatial data to create mosaics that bring the legibility dial up towards 10, and they're only going to continue to do that. And so we have, in the past half decade, started to bring in the technical skills into organizations to do imagery over here and to do mobility data over here. Okay, but the next revolution technically is they're going to begin to live together. And we're going to move from playing different instruments in the orchestra. We have our horn section here, our viola over here. We're going to start playing the orchestra more and more. That's already happening. And we're going to begin to not just have to hire technical instrumentalists, so to speak. We're going to have to hire conductors. And so we have this huge challenge here as we begin to hit daily, we're at daily refresh, but as we begin to hit this fusion point of the mosaic of legible, actionable information, we'll go faster and faster. Our protection issues are going to start, we're going to have to move on quicker loops, but so will our benefit, our extraction issues to get that value will have to move on a faster loop with a type of professional that we haven't fully built yet. And that's a huge challenge.
Yeah, no question about it. I do think that the kind of data kind of analytical demands on humanitarian professionals are about to go really through the roof, which, to Jennifer's point earlier, we may not really be ready for in multiple dimensions, particularly when we talk about inclusion and locality, which is the sort of other kind of, principal pressure on what is the structure of the humanitarian system per se. I'm mindful that I thought I saw Heather be able to unblock earlier, so I didn't want to lose your ability to ask your sort of data literacy point, which I think links to what Natty was just saying as well, more directly if you did want to jump in. Okay, no worries. Jos, when you think about these Maxar and images and the other kinds of remote sensing products that are coming out, how does that actually kind of fit into the schema that you were talking about earlier with the data sensitivity guidelines? I mean, these have been released in the press in many cases. There's been quite a lot of derived information from them, even regardless of the resolution in space. How I mean, is that different than how we've been thinking about mobility, or is that kind of fit within the same lane?
So I think that's an excellent question, Andrew, and I think there's a couple of different dimensions to sort of the sensitivity and the thinking on data responsibility when it comes to these images. I think first of all, we would probably sort of conceptually group them with the live mobility data that we've been already including in the sensitivity classification. Of course, that would depend on, as Natty was saying, the sort of temporal and then also the spatial sort of granularity. But I think the more important overarching point is that we are sort of very happy to sort of further improve this sensitivity classification with input and feedback from experts like yourselves, right? As I said, this is an evolving document. We've seen over the past couple of weeks and over the past 3 iterations that most of the data that we included in the first version of this classification has now been classified as less sensitive, which makes sense, right? We were taking quite a restrictive and cautious posture in the beginning of the response. And now that we start to figure out more, we feel like more data can be classified as less sensitive. And it's likely that the same will happen for this type of imagery and also the live mobility data. The other thing that we can do, of course, is to have certain caveats or exceptions that we include within the classification, which is another way of making sure that we sort of hit the right mark. And I think the last comment that I'll mention there is that it's been really key over the past few weeks to work very closely with our colleagues in the field. And this is also to Jennifer's point early and something that Natty was saying. I think it's been really important to hear from colleagues both through our OCHA counterparts, which is the office that we support, of course, but then also the clusters, to really hear from them with their domain expertise, how sensitive both mobility data, this type of imagery, but also other categories of data, how sensitive we should be classifying those. So we're really working with that sort of domain expertise and local field expertise. Thanks.
Thank you for the invitation to collaborate on that, and I hope that our colleagues take you up on that, because I think it's a very important kind of space for engagement as we go forward and answer a number of these questions. I want to give maybe a final ability to any final remarks. I'm mindful that we're at time. Rohini, did you want to any final remarks?
No, Andrew, thank you so much for convening this very important discussion as we all are moving towards using more and more of this mobility data and big data in general. I hope we can continue this conversation. I see some really great questions being raised in the chat that we could capitalize on and continue working on it. So very, very grateful to be part of this discussion today.
Thanks. And Natty, do you want to take it home?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about when humanitarians are at their best and at their worst. When we are at our best, we attempt to solve political problems through technical means. And that's usually how we step in the bear trap. When we are at our best, we realize that no single organization has the answer, and that the way any of us succeeds is the way we all succeed and all work together. And so, to end on a happy note, it is incredible to see around the table here as I'm looking through who's in the room. We have Jennifer, we have Ingmar, we have Heather. This is like the end of the American children's program Romper Room from the 80s, but we have name after name. We have Sarah, we have so many people who have all played roles in both the ethical technical and operational evolution of us doing this right in terms of preventing harm, but also accessing the value for affected populations. So that it is very good to see, we're not there yet, but we're getting there, and we're getting there together.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who participated in this. We will be following up with, we can circulate additional questions to folks that participated. We'll be posting the video on the Crisis Ready site, and I can share out the slides that I started at the beginning with. And I want to remind everyone that we'll be back. Our next event will be at the end of April, focusing on the white paper on mobility data and public health emergencies based on the Radcliffe Institute seminars from March and April of last year. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone again soon.